Ghosting, on the surface, seems like nothing more than the absence of words. A message that never arrives, a call that is never returned, a conversation left hanging in the air. Yet, for the human psyche, it is not a neutral void. It is a silence heavy with meaning, a silence that screams, that wounds, that buries itself deep within the unconscious. Because when someone disappears without explanation, they do not leave simply an empty space, they leave an open wound. Carl Jung once said that the unconscious cannot tolerate ambiguity. What it cannot understand, it turns into symbols, into dreams, into anxiety. That is why, when someone suddenly ignores us without warning, our mind does not rest. It begins to construct stories, scenarios, explanations. And each explanation is more painful than the last, because we rarely imagine the kind version. Almost always we end up believing that we weren't enough, that something about us drove the other away, that the fault lies within us. In this way, the external silence becomes a deafening, internal noise. Words bring closure. A breakup, no matter how painful, gives us a framework. This has ended. What is unspoken, on the other hand, echoes endlessly. It becomes a space where everything fits. Doubt, anguish, obsession. That is the paradox of ghosting. What seems easier for the one who vanishes becomes devastating for the one left waiting. And here arises the essential question: why does what's unsaid hurt more than a clear ending? Because the explicit allows us to grieve, to name the pain, to reframe the experience. The unexplained instead traps us in a kind of emotional limbo where nothing ends and everything remains unfinished. This silence, then, is not empty. It is absolute rejection. It is a shattered mirror in which the abandoned person looks for answers and finds only distorted reflections. And the cruelest part is that, in the absence of truth, we end up creating narratives against ourselves. Ghosting, thus, becomes a psychological act that erodes self-esteem. Not because the other person left, but because they left without voice, without face, without explanation. And when something disappears without closure, it leaves no room for peace, only for the invisible wound that never stops being heard. Ghosting is not only a personal rejection, it awakens something far deeper, an ancient wound that belongs not just to you, but to humanity as a whole. Carl Jung spoke of the collective unconscious, a reservoir of shared memories, instincts, and fears that lie beneath the surface of every individual psyche. Within that reservoir lives one of the most primal terrors of all, the fear of abandonment. Thousands of years ago, to be abandoned by the tribe was not simply sad, it was fatal. Survival depended on belonging. To be excluded meant hunger, exposure, and death. This ancient coding still pulses in our nervous system today. So when someone vanishes from your life without explanation, your body does not interpret it as a modern inconvenience, it feels it as an existential threat. That is why the silence of ghosting pierces so deeply. It echoes the ancestral terror of being left outside the circle of safety. Jungian psychology teaches that these wounds are not erased by progress or technology. They remain alive, whispering beneath our rational mind. When you are ghosted, you might tell yourself, "It's just a text that never came, just a person who moved on." But your unconscious is reading it differently. You are no longer chosen. You do not belong. You are left behind. And those words come not from the present, but from a wound carried for centuries through generations of human struggle. This is why ghosting feels disproportionate to the situation. Others may minimize it. Don't take it so seriously, just forget them. But the psyche knows better. The pain isn't only about that one person disappearing, it is about the reactivation of an ancient archetype, the exiled one. In myths, in dreams, and in human history, exile is one of the deepest punishments a soul can endure. To be unseen, unheard, and unacknowledged. This is not just modern dating drama. It is a shadow rising from the depths of the collective unconscious. And yet, here lies the possibility for transformation. By recognizing that ghosting taps into something much larger than your personal story, you can begin to separate your worth from the act itself. You can say to yourself, "This pain I feel is not just mine. It is the echo of humanity's oldest fear, and because I see it, I can begin to heal it." One of the most painful dimensions of ghosting lies in what you unconsciously gave to the other person. Carl Jung described projection as the act of placing parts of ourselves, desires, fears, ideals, even unlived potential, onto someone else. When you meet someone who awakens something in you, they don't just become a person in your life, they become a mirror for your hidden self. Think about it. When you were drawn to them, it wasn't only because of their words, their looks, or their presence. It was because, in them, you saw a reflection of something you were longing for within yourself. Maybe it was the sense of safety you've never fully felt. Maybe it was the excitement you suppressed for years. Maybe it was the validation of being seen and chosen. In their eyes, you recognized a piece of your own soul, and that recognition created a bond that felt larger than reason. But when ghosting happens, it's not just the person that disappears, it's also the reflection. The version of yourself that you saw through them suddenly vanishes. This is why the pain feels so consuming. It isn't only "they left me," it's "they took with them a part of who I thought I was becoming." The loss of the other becomes the loss of your own projection, and you are left disoriented. Who am I now, without that mirror? Jung warned that projections are double-edged. They can make us fall in love, but they can also trap us in illusions. Ghosting rips the illusion away abruptly. It doesn't give you the courtesy of time to untangle what was truly theirs and what was yours all along, and so the wound festers. You might believe that they stole something essential from you, when in reality they only held up a mirror. The reflection was yours from the beginning. This is where healing begins, by reclaiming the parts of yourself you had unknowingly handed over. The admiration, the affection, the longing you felt, they are clues to your own hidden potential. Ghosting hurts because it feels like a theft, but in truth, nothing essential was taken. The projection returns to its source, you. And in that painful return lies the chance to rediscover your own depth without depending on someone else to show it to you. There is a particular cruelty in what ghosting leaves behind: the unfinished. A story without an ending. A sentence cut mid-word. A door left half open. For the psyche, this is not a small matter. Jung emphasized that the unconscious craves completion, resolution, closure. What is left unfinished does not fade into silence. It lingers, echoing, demanding attention. When someone vanishes without explanation, your mind enters a restless cycle. You replay conversations, search for clues, analyze every detail as if decoding a secret code. Why? Because the human psyche cannot tolerate an incomplete narrative. We are creatures of meaning, and when meaning is denied, we invent as it ourselves. Ghosting forces you into the role of detective, building theories about what went wrong, often at the cost of your peace. This lack of closure is not neutral, it is traumatic. Trauma, at its core, is the body's response to an experience it cannot fully process. Ghosting is a rupture without a narrative, an emotional wound without stitches. And so it keeps bleeding. Unlike a breakup where words, however harsh, offer finality, ghosting leaves you suspended in a limbo. You are neither together nor fully apart. You are haunted by the absence of an ending. Psychologically, this triggers what Jung might call a complex, an emotional knot that reactivates itself over and over. You might think you've moved on, and yet a song, a smell, or the memory of a text thread reopens the loop. The unfinished refuses to be buried. It becomes a phantom, following you until you dare to confront it. But here lies a paradox. The very wound of the unfinished can become the ground for transformation. If the ghoster will not give you closure, then you must give it to yourself. You must create the ending they denied you. To say, this absence is the answer. This silence is the message, and I will no longer wait for words that will never arrive. Ghosting teaches you, in its brutal way, that closure is not always received. It is chosen, and in choosing it for yourself, you reclaim power from the one who vanished. The unfinished becomes finished, not by their words, but by your decision to step out of limbo and into freedom. When someone ghosts you, the first impulse is to turn all the pain inward. What did I do wrong? What is so unworthy about me that they couldn't even say goodbye? But often, ghosting says less about you and more about the shadow of the one who disappears. Carl Jung defined the shadow as the part of the psyche that contains everything we reject, deny, or cannot yet accept about ourselves. The ghoster, in many cases, is not escaping you. They are escaping the confrontation with their own shadow. To sit across from you, to have an honest conversation, to admit they are afraid, unready, or simply unwilling, this would mean facing aspects of themselves they cannot bear: cowardice, immaturity, guilt, vulnerability. So instead, they vanish. Silence becomes their shield. But here's the paradox. In disappearing, they project that shadow onto you. Their inability to handle conflict leaves you with the chaos. Their refusal to face discomfort forces you to hold the weight of uncertainty. Ghosting is, in this way, an act of psychological projection. One person transferring their own fear of confrontation onto another's wound. And yet, the shadow is not only theirs. When you are ghosted, your own shadow rises too. Feelings of abandonment, unworthiness, rage, or deep loneliness surface with intensity. It is tempting to believe the pain was caused entirely by the other person. But ghosting is also a mirror. It reflects back the parts of you that remain unhealed, the wounds that were waiting for a trigger to awaken. This is why ghosting feels disproportionate. It isn't just about one person disappearing. It is the meeting of two shadows, yours and theirs. Their silence activates your oldest wounds, and your grief magnifies the depth of their avoidance. In that collision, the invisible becomes visible. To recognize this dynamic is to reclaim power. Instead of asking endlessly, "Why did they do this to me?" you begin to see, "This is their shadow speaking, not my worth." And even more profoundly, this pain is showing me my own shadow, the parts of me that still crave healing, validation, or closure. Ghosting, then, becomes more than a disappearance. It becomes a confrontation with what lies hidden in them and in you. And while they may run from their shadow, you have the choice to face yours. That is where the true transformation begins. Ghosting hurts not only because of what is taken away in the present, but because it stirs echoes of old wounds that live inside you. The person who disappears becomes an unexpected mirror, reflecting back every abandonment, every silence, every rejection that your heart has carried before. What seems like a single act in the present awakens a chorus of past losses. Carl Jung taught that nothing in the psyche exists in isolation. Each new experience connects to an older thread, weaving into a tapestry of memory that extends far beyond the moment. When someone ghosts you, the pain is not only about them. It is about the father who wasn't fully there, the mother who couldn't hold your emotions, the friend who betrayed your trust, the lover who once left without explanation. The current silence reverberates with all those earlier silences, amplifying the ache until it feels unbearable. This is why ghosting feels so much heavier than logic would suggest. Rationally, you may say, it was just a few weeks of talking, or it wasn't even a real relationship. But emotionally, the wound opens deeper, because your unconscious does not measure pain in calendar time. It measures it in symbols. and the symbol of sudden disappearance is tied to your most primal fears of being unseen, unheard, unworthy of staying. In this sense, ghosting becomes less about what the other person did and more about what it reveals inside you. The abandoned child archetype, long buried, rises to the surface. The adult self may try to dismiss it, but the inner child cries out, "Not again. Not another goodbye without a word." The pain you feel is the dialogue between who you are now and who you once were, still longing for reassurance. And here lies a hidden invitation. The ghoster may never return to explain, but their silence forces you to turn inward. To ask, what wounds am I carrying that make this silence echo so loudly? And in that question, a new possibility appears, the chance to hold yourself in ways no one else did, to become the presence that never abandons. Thus, the pain of the inner mirror, though agonizing, can also become sacred, for it shows you not just the loss of another, but the path toward healing the abandoned parts of your own soul. One of the most devastating aftershocks of ghosting is the spiral of self-questioning it leaves behind. The moment the silence stretches into certainty, the mind begins its interrogation. What did I do wrong? Was I too much? Was I not enough? In that invisible courtroom, you become both the accused and the judge, sentencing yourself for a crime you never committed. Carl Jung observed that the human psyche has a tendency to internalize blame when faced with the unknown. Ambiguity is intolerable. The unconscious rushes to fill it with meaning, and the meaning it often chooses is self-condemnation. Because if you were the problem, then the world is still predictable. Change yourself, and maybe you'll be safe next time. But if the other person's silence had nothing to do with you, then you are left in a far more frightening reality. That human connection is fragile, unpredictable, and beyond your control. Ghosting exploits this psychic vulnerability. It blurs the line between guilt and worth. Instead of seeing the act as a reflection of the other person's inability to communicate, you absorb it as proof of your own insufficiency. If I were truly lovable, they wouldn't have disappeared. The wound deepens, not just because of their silence, but because of the story you tell yourself in its aftermath. But here is where Jungian insight offers a shift. What feels like rejection of your essence is often only avoidance of theirs. Their silence speaks of their fear, their immaturity, their shadow, not your lack of value. The confusion lies in mistaking their behavior as a mirror of your worth, when in truth it is only a mirror of their limits. The challenge, then, is to separate the two, to see the guilt narrative for what it is, a defense mechanism, and to reclaim your inherent worth beyond their actions. This is no easy task, for the unconscious clings tightly to the illusion that you could have done something different. Yet healing begins when you dare to declare, "Their silence is not my shame. My value is not up for debate." Ghosting tries to collapse worth into guilt, but you can unweave them. By refusing to equate someone else's absence with your inadequacy, you begin to step out of the trap. You reclaim the truth Jung hinted at, that your worth is intrinsic, untouchable, and never defined by another's refusal to see it. Ghosting may feel like a modern phenomenon born from smartphones and dating apps, but in truth, it taps into something far older, a timeless archetype that Jung would have recognized instantly. The disappeared one, the figure who vanishes without explanation, who slips into the shadows, leaving behind only questions, silence, and longing. Throughout myths and legends, this archetype appears again and again. The parent who leaves and never returns. The warrior who goes to battle and is swallowed by the unknown. The lover who vanishes into the forest, never to be seen again. These stories haunt human imagination because they reflect one of our deepest existential anxieties: the loss that cannot be explained, the absence that cannot be filled. When someone ghosts you, they unconsciously step into this archetypal role. they become not just a person who failed to send a text, but a manifestation of the ancient pattern of disappearance. Your unconscious recognizes this, even if you do not. That is why the pain feels larger than life, disproportionate to the time or depth of the relationship. The wound isn't only about them, it's about the collective memory of every disappearance humanity has ever endured. And there is something particularly cruel about this archetype. It denies closure. Death, as painful as it is, can eventually be mourned, but disappearance lingers. It creates a vacuum that the imagination cannot help but fill with fantasies, fears, or endless what-ifs. The disappeared one does not simply leave. They continue to haunt precisely because their absence has no frame. Yet Jung also taught that archetypes are not only prisons, they are invitations. To recognize ghosting as the reappearance of an ancient pattern is to see it in a larger context. Instead of personalizing it endlessly, what did I do wrong? You begin to realize, this is the archetype speaking through my life. This is the drama of disappearance playing itself again. And in that recognition, something shifts. The ghoster becomes less of a villain and more of a symbol of life's uncertainty, of the fragility of human bonds, of the inevitability of loss. Painful, yes, but also liberating? Because when you name the archetype, you begin to free yourself from its grip. You see that while they may have disappeared, you remain. And in the silence they left behind, you have the chance to write a story that no absence can erase. At first, ghosting feels like pure destruction, a collapse of trust, of hope, of the fragile sense of safety that comes from being seen and acknowledged. The silence pierces like a blade, leaving you raw, restless, and stripped of answers. But in the language of Jung, every wound also carries the seed of transformation. Pain, when faced instead of avoided, becomes a doorway into a deeper kind of self-knowledge. The disappearance of the other forces you into an encounter with yourself. Without their words, you are left with your own. Without their gaze, you must learn to see yourself. This is the paradox of ghosting. While it begins as abandonment, it can end as initiation. It pushes you to discover that your identity and worth cannot be outsourced to someone else's presence. Jung often spoke of individuation, the process of becoming whole by integrating all aspects of the psyche, both light and shadow. Ghosting, brutal as it is, accelerates this process. The loneliness you feel is a summons to turn inward, to meet the parts of you that still hunger for validation, that still equate silence with worthlessness. And in facing them, you begin to reclaim your power. Pain, when resisted, festers, but pain, when witnessed, transforms. To sit with the ache of being ghosted is to allow yourself to feel the raw vulnerability of being human, the longing to be chosen, the fear of being forgotten, the ache of not being enough. And, paradoxically, the moment you fully allow, those feelings is the moment they begin to release their grip. What begins as a wound can become a crucible. From the fire of rejection emerges resilience. From the silence of absence comes the clarity of your own voice. From the fracture of abandonment arises the realization that you are not broken. You are being reshaped. The one who ghosted you may never return, may never explain, may never acknowledge the impact of their silence. But their absence can become your teacher. It can show you where you still abandon yourself, where you still silence your own needs, where you still disappear from your own life. And in healing those places, the pain no longer defines you. It transforms you. At first glance, ghosting seems like pure absence, an empty space where once there was connection. Yet, in the language of the psyche, absence is never empty. It is a vessel. It is a silence pregnant with meaning. And if you dare to sit with it, that absence can become alchemy, a transformation of what wounds you into what strengthens you. Carl Jung believed that the psyche seeks wholeness, and often it does so through opposites. Light is born of shadow. Strength is born of fragility. Wisdom is born of pain. In this sense, ghosting is a paradoxical gift. The silence that seems to strip you of answers also invites you to listen more deeply to your own voice. The space left by another's disappearance can become the ground where your true presence begins to take root. The alchemy lies in how you interpret the void. If you treat it as a grave, it becomes despair. If you treat it as soil, it becomes growth. Absence, then, is not simply loss, it is potential. It is the possibility of discovering that you are capable of holding yourself, of being your own witness, of continuing your story even when someone else refuses to give you an ending. This does not mean denying the hurt. The wound is real, the silence cuts deeply, and the longing for closure may never fully disappear. But alchemy never erases the raw material. It reshapes it. Just as lead is transformed into gold, so can abandonment be transformed into self-revelation. The very silence that once screamed rejection can begin to whisper truth. I am still here. I am enough. I do not disappear from myself. The one who ghosted you may remain a mystery, but their absence no longer has to define you. In choosing to transmute the pain, you become more than the wound they left behind. You become the alchemist of your own soul, turning silence into song, loss into wisdom, absence into presence. In the end, ghosting is not the final word. The final word belongs to you, to the meaning you create, to the strength you uncover, to the gold you forge out of the ashes of what vanished. That is the true alchemy of absence.